Welcome to Ohio Roots, the official podcast of the Ohio Genealogical Society. Join us as we embark on a captivating journey through Ohio's rich genealogy, history, and abundant resources. Hosted by me, OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, this podcast brings you insightful conversations with a diverse array of guests, from OGS members, chapter leaders, and staff to renowned genealogists, historians, and influential figures within the genealogical community. Each episode delves into fascinating topics and captivating stories. So grab your headphones, hit that play button, and join us on this enthralling journey of Ohio's roots. Discover your roots and light up your genealogy. Join us for the Ohio Genealogical Society's annual conference, April 30th through May 3rd, 2025, at the beautiful Kalahari Resort in Sandusky, Ohio. Learn from top genealogy experts, explore groundbreaking research techniques, and connect with fellow family history enthusiasts. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned pro, this is the must-attend event for discovering your story. Visit ogs.org to register today. That's ogs.org. Let's light up your family history together. OGS, connecting families, past and present. My guest on today's episode of the Ohio Roots podcast is Kate Penney Howard. Kate is a genetic genealogist specializing in brick wall work, high ROH, and endogamy, and she'll be doing some presentations this year at the 2025 OGS conference in Kalahari. So I hope you enjoy this conversation today with Kate Penney Howard. Well, I'd like to thank Kate Penney Howard for joining me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. Kate will be another presenter at the 2025 OGS conference this year at Kalahari, and this is part of our attempt to kind of preview all the things you're going to be seeing if you're attending the conference. Kate, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be coming to OGS this year.
Yeah, we have a good time.
Yeah, I've heard.
I'm going to ask you a question I kind of ask everybody when I interview them for the podcast, because we are a genealogical group and we are a genealogical podcast. And all of us have our own, what do they call comic book heroes, origin stories, I guess, of how we got involved in doing genealogy ourselves and then helping others. So I'd love to hear what it was that got you excited and interested in doing genealogy.
I was really fortunate to be born with a great-great-grandmother who was living, who, when I have memories of her, was just around 100, and she lived to be 102.
Right.
At the same time, Little House on the Prairie was the big thing on TV. So I was born in 1972. So
you and I are very similar in age then, yes.
Exactly, yes. So, and the third thing that was happening at the same time was the bicentennial.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And so my great-great-grandmother, her name was Minnie, and Arminda, her name was, but we called her Minnie. And I called her Little Grandma because I had no clue like what a great-great-grandma was when I was 4. Right. She said I was all elbows and knees, and I was always on her lap asking her questions, especially when one day I was telling her about Little House on the Prairie, which was pretty much set in her childhood.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was telling her about Little House on the Prairie and how they rode on a covered wagon. And she said, well, we rode on a covered wagon. What? And I told her about the crank phone. And she's like, yeah, this is like not news to me. And so I asked her just tons of questions about what it was like. And for a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old to have that opportunity to literally tap back a century.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
She had 12 children. She was the wife on a dairy farm, which meant she worked at the dairy farm.
Right. Sure.
Yeah. And she was this tiny little thing, and she was never sick a day in her life. And she just had so many things to share and such a unique perspective that, for me, that's how I originated, was as the person who carried these stories of when they drove on the corduroy road from Indiana to northern lower peninsula of Michigan, where they settled as a child. Just to have those stories, it makes history come alive.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting as you say that, the narratives and the stories that come alive. Because I know, one of your presentations this year at OGS is about creating narratives based on a specific source.
Right.
And I think that that's something that we as family historians and genealogists sometimes have struggle with, because we might be more interested in X's and O's in a sense than in the narratives. Talk to me a little bit about that program.
So my grandfather was a paratrooper in the 517th PRCT
Mhm.
during World War II. This was the beginning of what would become special forces. So this was an elite combat paratrooper um, regiment. Now, one thing I just have to say right offhand is that I'm not really interested in military history
Sure.
naturally. And so when I decided I was going to take this box of V-mail that my grandfather had sent and my grandmother had kept,
Mhm.
as well as the stories that my grandfather happened to be that person who would always tell me a story if I asked him, but he was
Right.
very reluctant to talk about World War II.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
He was a machine gunner as well as a paratrooper because what I didn't understand as a child was that paratroopers didn't land as if they were playing a game of touch football. You know, I kind of assumed that my grandpa jumped behind enemy lines and then
Right.
run,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not that he had to unload and then use a machine
Yeah.
gun.
Right.
That was kind of an adult revelation. As I became older and as he became older, I was able to spend more time with him in the twilight hours. And that would be when he would start to tell me stories.
Mhm.
And we had a bond that was, I think, pretty unique.
Yeah.
And he was able to share with me these stories that he had not told very often.
Right.
And so I became the repository of those stories. So I have the stories and I have the letters,
Mhm.
but they don't really dovetail together really well.
Right.
So what I don't know, what I didn't know when starting this project is what exactly the day-to-day experiences that my grandfather had after they jumped into southern France and then made their way to the Battle of the Bulge. Those were the,
Sure.
the questions that what was it really like?
Mhm.
So there are other sources that are available from which you
Right.
can restore that story. You can
Yeah.
restore it. Um, you can look at memoirs of other people who might have been in this maybe not the same company, but maybe a different company. The
Mhm.
company that my grandfather is in is actually not very well documented. And the famous person who's written a memoir out of there was in another company. But
Okay. Sure.
if they say Bob Hope came to visit us,
Right.
then
Right.
he came to visit
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
them, not just that
Yeah.
one company.
Yeah.
So, so I can restore details
Yeah.
out of those things and bring them together. So my goal is to create something like a novel, but not as fictional,
Right. Sure.
But there are stories that my grandfather told, um, which were very brief
Mhm.
and not full of detail. I can take what I see as a historian and what I can find in other records, and then kind of embroider a little bit so that
Sure.
it does read more like a
Right.
story than a fact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar. My grandfather was in World War II, was a armored infantryman, and his responsibility was whenever they entered a town, the infantrymen climbed up on top of the tanks and manned the machine guns while the tank crews buttoned up and didn't come out. And he
Yes.
says those are some of his most frightening experiences. Where we're sitting on top of a tank alone, manning a machine gun, and he wrote a memoir, which is great. So yeah, I mean, when you have those kinds of things available, that's always nice.
So my
I mean,
grandfather was injured on Christmas Eve in the Battle of the Bulge,
okay.
and they were actually sent out to be that kind of an attachment for a U.S. tank squadron, and
Yeah.
so that's when he was wounded, was when he
Yeah.
was defending tanks.
That'll
So
do it.
yes, yes. And that was called Task Force Kane,
Mhm.
which was one of the pivotal moments of the Battle of the Bulge.
Right. What I liked about, I saw the programs you're going to be offering this year, and you've got a couple different tracks in a sense that you're working on, because you've got this narrative aspect between both the story you just talked about, but also about your grandfather's birth father, and the story of him. And I don't want to get too much into it, but but again, the idea of creating narratives about your family, and so that they are, in many ways, I think sometimes it's easier to pass down family history when you create narratives, as opposed to simply family trees.
Yes. Well, one thing, so I'm also a pastor, and one thing that is important to me is understanding the difference between facts and stories, and how stories can be very truthful, but not necessarily factual.
Sure.
So as a pastor, I might say that there are passages in Scripture that are to be taken as fact, but I might also say there are passages in Scripture which are meant to characterize either a person or a time.
Sure.
And they're not necessarily meant to be factual, but they're meant to be ways that we explain character.
If you enjoy listening to the Ohio Roots podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could go to whatever platform it is that you listen and give us a good review. Reviews help us get more listeners and reach more people with Ohio Roots and what we're trying to do with the Ohio Genealogical Society. So please leave us a nice review, and thanks for listening.
For example, like we all know that there's this story about George Washington where he chopped down a cherry tree and then went to his dad and said, "I cannot tell a lie." And then we also all know that didn't actually happen. But there's truth in that story. And it's not that he chopped down a cherry tree, but that he was a person of high moral character, and that was what we wanted to remember about him.
Right. So since your grandpa's birth father was obviously moral character was different.
So
don't give away your talk.
My husband's
okay.
Your birth grandfather, yes.
Okay.
So it's a really interesting story. My husband's family is from Kentucky, and there is literally a court case that is in case law because there was an appeal. And so there's a particular aspect of that is still relevant today about evidence in a trial. Yeah. And in the case, there is literally an accusation of paternity right before somebody else gets killed. And so it's written into this case law. And the child that they are talking about is my husband's, the person who raised him as grandfather. He's not actually the father of my husband's dad, because there's a whole bunch of genetic genealogy nonsense going on there. So the neat thing was trying to take that case law, back it up with DNA, which was very easy to do. And then the funny thing was when I started snooping around in the area in Kentucky, which was very impoverished area at the time that this happened 100 years ago. When there is poverty, there is often other injustices that happen as well. And so there was a lot of violence in the area, and it was not uncommon for everybody to have relatives who had been killed in a battle, duel, shootout, whatever. And so when I started asking about the person who was charged with the crime, because I was trying to figure out who the Howard was who got killed, when I started asking questions, this lady came after me with harsh words that I was glad I was another state away. And she was basically telling, I was asking about something that happened in 1928.
Right,
and she was after me for besmirching her uncle's, story. Yeah. And I was just asking, does anybody know who this guy was that got killed?
Right,
Yeah. So it took me a few more dips into asking about that again. And finally, I was able to talk to some distant cousins of my husband who said, Oh yeah, we knew that it was that person. That's who she said was the father of the
Okay.
grandpa. So the people that were there knew all along, but the
Sure,
people who moved
sure.
away had stopped telling that story.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's what's interesting to me. I know one thing what's special about Ohio for me, from looking at it from a genealogical standpoint, is the fact that Ohio is kind of a pass-through state, where
Yeah.
many people's stories come through Ohio, but don't necessarily reside here. They may go to Michigan, they may go to Indiana, they may go to California, they may go any number of places,
Hmm.
and I find that that's always an interesting thing. That sometimes those stories go away from the place in which they happened, which is, I think, is what you're describing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Now you're also doing some discussions that deal specifically with DNA. One of the things is, when is DNA a thorny thicket? And I'm curious as to what leads you to that title.
Sure. So my husband's grandfather's case is a
Hmm.
particularly good example of that. Uh, there is a lot of cousin marriage in that particular area.
Sure.
It's not uncommon. It also happens. Ohio has a lot of Palatinate Germans, for example,
Hmm.
and cousin marriage is very common between our Palatinate German ancestors. So when we're working with DNA, the most successful work is done when there are very distinct clusters of relatives that connect to a recent common ancestor.
Hmm.
And so when you have people who get married who are cousins to each other, then that obscures that distinctiveness. And there
Sure.
are
Sure.
there are alternate ways to go about doing. One thing that we use in genetic genealogy is called the Leeds method, which is a very simple sorting method. Um, the Leeds method can be broken by what we call endogamy, which is when people are related within the community. Because you have a very small percentage of DNA that all of the people in the community share because of
Right.
their shared ancestry. So what I'm going to talk about in that particular session is ways that if you know that you are working with a community that has endogamy, that you can use some other tricks and strategies to um, isolate people in ways that turn down that noise of the
Hmm.
endogamy, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah. Now, is your other talk on Jewish settlements in the Ohio River Valley, is that kind of an expansion on that idea?
Well, that is actually yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, that is definitely so. Jewish people often have a significant amount of endogamy. They'll
Mhm.
joke about how they've got 20,000 fourth cousins and no closer matches. Um, in my experience, I had come to the uh, assumption, I think is correct, that you know Jewish people lived in Chicago and New York
Right.
and things
Right.
like that because that is where I had encountered them. Even though I spent most of my life in rural Michigan,
Mm.
Indiana, it just didn't really come to mind. So I was working
Hmm.
on a DNA case, and I was I worked on their great grandparent and solved that. And then they said, well, let's work on my great great grandparent then. And so we worked on that case. And I said, I don't, and they were in Evansville, Indiana, which is down on the river.
Hmm.
And I said, I don't know how to like tell you this, but it looks like this person was Jewish. And of course, the person was who I was working with was not Jewish.
Yeah. Right.
And so I said, I have to do some research. So then I had to like put it on pause and read like
Right.
47 books about Jewish settlements
Yeah.
in rural, you know, United States. And it turns out that there's this really fascinating story, which gets dwarfed by the later um, emigrations of Jewish people to large
Sure.
cities. So it
Right.
wasn't incorrect. I just didn't know the whole story.
Right.
So in the early 1800s, we had this great um, influx of Jewish people who were mostly coming from the East Coast.
Mhm.
And one of the most famous ones was a guy whose name was Levi Strauss.
Right.
And he was Jewish. He left his brother on the East Coast, came to, I think, Cincinnati, and he was instrumental in outfitting the 49ers who went
Right.
to California for the gold rush, right? But they had these amazing networks of merchants that were based on the East Coast, and then their brother, cousin, whatever, would come further west and settle along the Ohio River, and it became this wonderful transportation and merchandise network. So and the really amazing thing to me was it appears to me that people were very integrated in their community, and that churches and synagogues were working together for community projects and things like that. So that, they were part of the community, which is really wonderful.
Yeah. It's interesting. I live in New Philadelphia, Ohio, and our Jewish history really is more 19th century. And matter of fact, there's two houses down from me that during that period was the town synagogue, even though it was actually, originally built as a residence. So, but they came and then they moved on. Again, this is our Ohio story, I guess. But so, well, Kate, I'm really looking forward to seeing your talks, as much of them as I can while I'm there. I want to thank you again for taking some time to speak to me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. And I hope you have a good time at the OGS conference this year.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Ready to light up your genealogy? Mark your calendars for the Ohio Genealogical Society's annual conference happening April 30th to May 3rd, 2025 at Kalahari Resorts in Sandusky, Ohio. Immerse yourself in inspiring workshops, expert-led sessions, and exciting discoveries that will help you uncover your family's history. Plus, enjoy the perfect blend of learning and relaxation at one of Ohio's favorite destinations. Don't miss out. Visit ogs.org to learn more and to register. That's ogs.org. Come, connect, learn, and ignite your family story. Well, I had a good time chatting with Kate today. I thought she had a lot of interesting stories to tell us, and I love her narrative style of telling genealogy and family history. I think it's something we can all learn from. So I hope you get a chance to check out Kate's programs at the 2025 OGS Conference at Kalahari this year. She's doing 4 of them, so look at your registration booklet and figure out how you can get to at least one of them, because I know you'll enjoy them. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the OGS Ohio Roots Podcast.
The Ohio Roots Podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Genealogical Society, the premier gateway for discovering your Ohio family history. Hosted by OGS Executive Director Noel Poyer and edited by Luke Poyer. Theme song is Beautiful Ohio, recorded by Bob Stanley and his orchestra in 1944. To learn more about joining the Ohio Genealogical Society, visit www.ogs.org.